Now we're gonna have our last presentation, which is by Andrew Camp from the University of Arkansas. The floor is yours.
All right, well, hello everybody. Today I'm going to be sharing some work that I did with my advisor who you saw earlier, Dr. Hema Zamaro. And we've been looking at some racial differences and ethnic differences in the choice of school modality during the COVID-19 pandemic. Before I start, I do want to thank the entire CIPHER team for making this data available. It's been fantastic and we're really appreciative. So for some context, by mid-March of 2020, school districts across the United States had closed in-person learning to try and prevent the spread of COVID. This led to significant changes in the lives of parents and students as remote learning expanded to an unprecedented level. In 2021 school year, a lack of centralized guidance in most states left reopening decisions up to individual districts, which resulted in very different experiences and opportunities for students who sometimes lived very close together. Across the United States, there are considerable differences in how particular areas chose to reopen. One decisions found that districts in more politically conservative areas were more likely to opt for in-person learning. However, many districts offered more than one option. For example, students whose district offered mainly in person might instead select to attend online to avoid potential COVID exposure. Survey responses from the Understanding Coronavirus in America Tracking Survey indicate that last fall, about 68% of parents used either remote or hybrid learning options. However, there were large differences by race and ethnicity, with Black and Hispanic students approximately 20 percentage points more likely to select hybrid or remote learning options. As apparent disproportionality in how students from different racial groups attended school might raise serious equity concerns. Data from a widely used online math program shows a significant difference in the engagement of students from high and low income backgrounds as compared to a pre-pandemic baseline, with more affluent students consistently more engaged than low income students. One study used a model to predict that learning losses will be particularly acute for high school students from low income neighborhoods, while students from higher income neighborhoods are relatively unaffected. There's also evidence that more affluent areas of the country sought out more remote learning resources when the schools closed, which may further point to the risk of a widening achievement gap. So our objective in our paper is to study factors that explain observed racial differences in learning modality, that's in-person, hybrid, or remote, which include the role of demographics, politics, trust, the supply of learning options, and the local COVID-19 outbreaks. We use data from the Understanding Coronavirus in America Tracking Survey that we heard about earlier today. And we also merged that data with some other sources, including election polling and census tract estimates of learning option availability and county level data about COVID-19 cases. So our primary source of data is wave 15 of the Understanding Coronavirus Survey, which was collected between September 30th and October 27th, 2020. The survey provides not only parent demographics, but also how their child is attending school and information about that school's policies. We control for type of school, public, private, or charter, if respondents were able to choose their school's modality, and a measure of pre-pandemic trust that was also collected, or we computed from questions asked during the Wave 15 survey. Secondly, we include a control for respondents' level of trust of media and health messaging using responses from Wave 7 of the tracking survey. We also use respondents' most recent responses to the USC 2020 election poll to categorize them as a Biden voter, a Trump voter, or an undecided voter. We use data from Johns Hopkins Center for System Science and Engineering to merge in county level estimates of COVID incidence and case fatality rate as of the first day of that Wave 15 survey. And finally, we used estimated prevalence of learning modalities merged at the census tract or county level to control for the availability of each option. These estimates come from a survey of over 12,000 public school districts, which is the most comprehensive database that we're aware of. So for our analytic strategy, we use a multinomial logit estimation approach to compare the relative probabilities of selecting in-person, remote, or hybrid learning options conditional upon sets of covariates. In our first specification, we use no controls to establish baseline racial differences in modality choice. Next, we had demographic controls and state fixed effects. In our third model, we had respondents' trust of their school, media messaging, political leanings, and local COVID context. And finally, in our most restricted model, we had controls for types of school, if respondents were able to make the choice of how their students return to learning, and their estimated exposure to various options. So on the next few slides, I'll be reporting the results of our analysis as average marginal effects. For in-person learning, we can see that the uncontrolled model, in the uncontrolled model, there are strong statistically significant differences by race. Holding all else equal, non-white respondents are between 15 and 19 percentage points less likely to select in-person learning as compared to white respondents. Once we add controls for state fixed effects and demographic differences, we see that now the estimate for, only the estimate for Black respondents remains statistically significant and is practically unchanged, about 1/10 of a percentage point more likely to select in person. However, adding in controls for politics, trust, and local COVID context, we see that Black respondents become approximately 23% more likely to select in-person learning than at baseline, though these respondents are still nearly 15 percentage points less likely than white respondents. Interestingly, the political partisanship appears to be unidirectional, with Trump supporters about 13 percentage points more likely to select in-person learning as compared to undecided voters, holding all else constant. Finally, in our fully restricted or most controlled model, racial differences are now statistically insignificant. Several of the added controls, such as the estimated supply of learning options, and if the respondent was given a choice, are significant and relatively large in magnitude. The most predictive factor, however, appears to be attendance at a private or religious school. Holding all else constant, respondents using private schools are 41 percentage points more likely to report in-person learning as compared to respondents using public schools. When we look at factors affecting remote modality usage, we again see relatively large and statistically significant average marginal effects for racial categories with no controls. However, in this case, we see the estimated marginal effects are now positive, indicating that non-white respondents are more likely to participate in remote learning. Like our results for in-person learning, we see that there is a statistically significant difference only for Black respondents after the introduction of demographic controls and state fixed effects. As compared to the first model, Black respondents in this model are about 6% less likely to attend school remotely. Though not shown in this table, we do find a relatively strong effect of employment on remote modality. Holding all else constant, being employed is associated with a 10 percentage point reduction in the likelihood of selecting remote learning. Outbreaks further reduces the likelihood of Black respondents participating in remote learning by 38% as compared to the uncontrolled specification. Again, we see significant estimates for political and COVID contextual, although they point in the opposite direction than they did for in-person learning. Additionally, respondents reported trust in their school prior to the pandemic is negatively associated with participation in remote learning modalities. Finally, in our fully controlled model, racial differences again disappear. Political partisanship, local outbreaks, type of school, and choice all appear to be significant factors in attending remotely. Our results for hybrid learning modality are somewhat different than the previous two, with uncontrolled model showing significant differences only for races other than Black, white, or Hispanic. When we include demographic controls and state fixed effects, we find no significant differences by race. And when we include some COVID contextual factors and voting, we do find statistically significant differences for the incidence rate and case fatality rate, but no other predictors are significant. Finally, attending a private school still appears to be a significant factor in attending the attendance decision. In this case, attending a private or religious school results in respondents being about 15 percentage points less likely to select hybrid modality. So in conclusion, we can explain the racial gap in learning modalities with our covariates. It appears that politics, type of school, and availability of supply play a sizable role for both remote and in-person learning. Political views appear to be asymmetric, with Trump voters less likely to select remote learning and more likely to select into in-person learning. And it might be interesting for future research to see if that effect kind of faded out after the election or inauguration. It also appears that when given the choice and opportunity, many parents are going to select in-person learning, and that parents seem responsible to local outbreaks of COVID-19. Thank you. Here are our Twitter handles in case you want to follow us there. We definitely appreciate any comments, questions, or feedback you can give.
Thanks, Andrew. That's very interesting. I'll start with the questions from the chat since we already have one. Jeffrey Grown asks, what is your source for the county level data on whether schools are in person or remote?
So we use a database from MCH strategic data that they've made available for academic research. And we also combine, it provides district NCES ID numbers. So we merge that with the census tracts that each district kind of has in their domain. And basically would conduct a weighted average based on district enrollment from there.
Right, thank you. I was gonna ask, what's your interpretation of the political preference variables? Is it really that Trump voters are more likely to choose in person, or is it that people who live in areas that are more pro-Trump are also more likely themselves to be pro-Trump, and then also more likely to have more options for in-person learning? So what I mean, is it like a personal decision versus where you live, kind of what your options are?
Yeah, I think that's a little bit tricky to disentangle. There was a paper that came out last fall that showed that if you lived in a conservative area, that was the biggest predictor of your district's decision making. I think it's probably a bit of both, but that's something that we can definitely look at further later on.
Well, if you're interested in that avenue, one thing you could look at is that you know, merging, perhaps seeing if you can merge in data for election outcomes and level.
That's a good idea.
Any other questions? Let me see. All right. If there aren't any other questions for Andrew, you can also ask questions to one of our previous panelists. So we still have a couple of minutes. Yes, here's another question from Frank Graves. Do you think that Trump voters are systematically less likely to rate COVID risk lower, and whether this might help explain part of this?
So in an earlier version of our project, we did include questions from the UAS survey that asked them to rate their perception that they'll be hospitalized if they are infected with COVID. We didn't find any statistically significant relationship there.
Okay, interesting. Kim is also writing the source of the data on school openings. So in case you're interested, you can copy that link. All right, if there aren't any other questions, then I'll hand it back to Tara.
Thank you so much, Francisco. Actually, this is our last session, so